Hello, my name is Dr. Laura Davis, and this is a short video giving you some background and context for Margaret Atwood's novel called The Testaments. So basically what I'm going to go over in this video is just a little background information so that you know what to expect when you're starting the novel, and I'll talk a little bit about its relation to its prequel, The Handmaid's Tale. I'm going to talk about the setting, so basically the time and the place that the novel takes place in, and I'm going to talk about the narration of the novel, and I'll talk a little bit about roles in Gilead for men and women as well. So Margaret Atwood's The Testaments was published in 2020. It's a sequel to Atwood's novel called The Handmaid's Tale, which was published in 1985. And that book, in some ways, I mean, Atwood had published previously, but in a lot of ways that book was really her breakthrough book. It was extremely well-known and popular, and interestingly, and this is very unusual, it topped the bestseller list years later. So in recent weeks and months, The Handmaid's Tale, as well as The Testaments, has topped the bestseller list in North America. So you need not have read The Handmaid's Tale in order to understand and enjoy The Testaments, okay? So that's important to understand. It's great if you want to read them sort of in order, but you can certainly read and understand The Testaments, as we're doing in my course, without having read The Handmaid's Tale. The novel is an example of speculative fiction. So whereas the genre of the literary work is a novel, the subgenre is speculative fiction. It might also be considered a work of dystopian fiction, or a dystopian novel, if you want to put it that way. So that basically means that it takes place in the future, where the future is imagined as a place that is dark, onerous, and oppressive. Okay, it is not an ideal futuristic time and place, but kind of the opposite to an ideal. It is a very dark future that is being imagined in this case. Now that is not to say that the book is not hopeful. I actually think it's quite hopeful. The Handmaid's Tale too is somewhat hopeful. I think The Testaments is actually very hopeful, but it's nevertheless takes place largely within a future that is seen as a dystopia. Okay, so what is Gilead? So talking about the place where this novel takes place. Largely, the novel takes place in a fictional, futuristic place called Gilead. And in a sense, it's not really fictional, the place, because it is imagined as the USA in the future. So interestingly, in The Handmaid's Tale, I don't think it's ever explicit that Gilead is supposed to be the USA in the future. It's maybe implied, but it's never said outright. But in The Testaments, it becomes very clear that Gilead is a futuristic USA. So it's a US that has that democracy has basically fallen, and now we have this oppressive place called Gilead that was the USA. The other thing that's mentioned, and this is a bit later in The Testaments, it's not right away, but it's good context, is that the entire USA is not Gilead. The western states, the west coast of the USA, has not fallen to this regime. So there is still kind of a portion of the USA that remains free of Gilead. Gilead, this oppressive country, is the rest of the USA. Canada is also separate in The Testaments from Gilead. So Canada is not part of Gilead. Okay, so Gilead is supposed to be the USA as it is imagined to be in the future, and as it has become oppressive and undemocratic. It is very much a patriarchal regime in which the men hold power and the women are very oppressed. All of the different roles of the women are generally oppressed. However, there are kind of elements of power. That's not to say that the women are powerless, okay? So that's the place in which the novel takes place. yeah, I'll get into a place a little bit more when I talk about narration. Time. So, as I have said, it takes place in the future. Now, the other interesting thing to note about the time in this book is that, so we have this Gilead place and time that's in the future, and the book actually takes place even more in the future than that. The book begins, and we find out that Gilead has in fact fallen, that Gilead is no longer, and so presumably democracy has been restored. And so we have what Atwood calls them the testaments. We have these testimonies from women who have survived Gilead, and we're now in kind of a post-Gilead future in which they are giving their testimony of what it was like to live in Gilead. So you really have to put your mind kind of doubly in the future. One, the future in which we have this regime of Gilead, and two, a kind of future even beyond that, when Gilead is no longer, and as I said, presumably democracy is restored, and we have people kind of reading these testimonies of people who lived through Gilead. Now, just to take a minute to relate this to The Handmaid's Tale. The Handmaid's Tale obviously took place in Gilead as well. At the end of The Handmaid's Tale, the narrator, so it's narrated by a handmaid, she's the one telling her tale, the narrator escapes. So the sense is at the end of The Handmaid's Tale, the narrator, Offred, has escaped this oppressive regime of Gilead. And so it's hopeful in that sense. But Gilead has not fallen at the end of Handmaid's Tale. We still have this oppressive regime going on. In the Testaments, we know that Gilead is now no longer, that Gilead is a thing of the past, even though from our perspective, Gilead's in the future. But there's this post-future where Gilead is no longer. So we have Aunt Lydia, well, I'll talk about the narrators in a minute, but we have Aunt Lydia kind of at the very beginning of the text starting to tell us her testimony of what it was like to play her part as she did in Gilead. Now, one more thing I'll mention about time. The very, very end of the novel, it kind of ends with this history conference, this historian telling about these testaments, and it says that the year is 2197 in which that takes place. Both the end of The Handmaid's Tale and the end of the Testaments end with this kind of a historian kind of talking about this as if it was history, right? So again, we have to really put ourselves kind of more in the future. We're looking at this futuristic world, but that futuristic world is being told from even a further future. Okay, so it's really interesting in terms of both time and place. Okay, narrators. There are 3 narrators in the Testaments. The first narrator is Aunt Lydia, or Lydia. She begins the novel, so when you first read it and you find that Lydia is talking about the statue, which is her, that is Aunt Lydia. Okay, so we will find her narrating through first-person narration at various moments throughout the text, and those are kind of marked. You'll be able to tell through voice as well. They're marked by chapters and sections in the novel, but you'll also be able to, after a while, understand the voices of each of these narrators. So there's 3 narrators. Number 1, Aunt Lydia. The book begins with her narrating. Number 2 is Agnes. Now, Agnes, you will find her narrating starting in, I believe, chapter 2. It's very early on as well. She is being brought up to be a wife of a commander in Gilead. So we have Aunt Lydia is kind of an older person playing a role of an aunt. I'll get into the roles in a minute. And then you have Agnes, who's being brought up, being groomed to be a wife of a commander within Gilead. And she's telling her story. Thirdly, we have Daisy, and she doesn't come in to start narrating till about chapter 7, but you'll notice it because her voice is really distinctive. It's very different from Agnes's voice and Aunt Lydia's voice, and it sounds more like how we talk. So she is from Canada, and so interestingly, the book in part takes place in Canada, though it mostly takes place in Gilead. There are also parts of it that take place in Canada during the time of Gilead. And this is where we get Daisy. the Canadian girl telling her story. Okay, so 3 narrators, all telling the story in first person. You'll know when you're going from one narrator to the next because the chapters are marked, the voices are different. The 3 narrators are Aunt Lydia, Agnes, and Daisy from Canada. Aunt Lydia is an aunt. I'll get into the roles in a minute. Agnes is a young woman being groomed to be a wife of a commander, and Daisy is also a young woman in Canada. Okay, so the roles that men and women play in Gilead. There are certain roles that are available to men and women in Gilead, and you'll become familiar with these roles fairly early on, starting from I think chapter 2, when Agnes starts telling about how she was taught growing up in Gilead. Okay, and you might be a bit confused in starting to read that chapter 2 and all of the views that Agnes is putting forth when she talks about, if I show a foot, I'm gonna allure men and so on. These are things not necessarily that she believes truly. You can see her constantly questioning these things, but they are things that she has been told and she has been taught by the system, which is Gilead, by the aunts who teach her and run the system. Okay, so those kind of things that she says are true are things that she says that she is being taught are true by this oppressive regime. And as I said, you can see these moments when she sort of questions throughout. Her story in chapter 2 of her birth is really interesting. Margaret Atwood will be referring to fairy tales and alluding to them throughout the text. It's also a kind of origin story because it has to do with her birth. And there is, even though it's fantastical and it's fairy tale-like, there is an element of truth in that story. And so, yeah, that'll become important later. Okay, so roles in the Testaments. For women, there are just a few roles that you can play. You can be a wife. Now, this isn't just open to anybody. Only certain women can become wives. Agnes is one of those women that has been born into a place where she will become a wife as the daughter of Tabitha. And she is being, as I said, groomed to be married to a commander. Now, the commanders are kind of the highest level of men in Gilead. They're sort of the businessmen, and they're the highest level. So Agnes is kind of groomed to be a fairly upper class, like an upper class woman married to a powerful commander. So you can become a wife. That's her fate. Agnes's fate is to become a wife. You can become a Martha. Marthas are basically servants that work in the kitchens. So they prepare the meals and those kinds of things. So there are wives, there are Marthas, there are handmaids. The handmaids are, they work for the commanders as well, and they are basically brought into the household when the wife of a commander is infertile and can't have children. And so in this futuristic world, there seems to be a lot of infertility. And so the women who are fertile are valuable to the commanders and to this society. So if the wife of the family is not fertile, which is very common, a handmaid will be brought in, basically to be, in a sense, the sex slave for the commander, to have the child or children for the family. And as soon as that child is born by the handmaid, the child has to be given to the wife of the commander. So it really is, in this world, the wife's child, even though it's the handmaid who's actually having sex with the commander and giving birth to his child. She has to hand it over to the wife right away. So handmaids are brought into the household to have children for the commander. And as I said, the Handmaid's Tale is told from the perspective of a handmaid all the way through, a handmaid named Offred. But this book is not, okay? We don't get Offred really in this, she's alluded to, but we don't get her in the Testaments at all. Instead, we get Agnes, who's groomed to be a wife. We get her perspective, and we get Aunt Lydia's perspective, okay? So there's Marthas, there's handmaids, there's wives, and there's aunts. Okay, now the aunts are in a way similar to nuns. They do not marry. They run the schools where they teach the girls to, they teach them the values of Gilead, to be subservient to commanders, and so on. So they are really kind of the teachers who teach certain values of this oppressive regime, and they bring up these girls to play the, so-called appropriate roles that they need to play within Gilead. Now, Aunt Lydia is obviously one of the aunts. The interesting thing about the aunts, so they don't marry, they live at Agnes Hall, which is, in a sense like a convent or like a school, and they are the only women that are allowed to read and write in this system. Commanders can read and write. Books are not allowed for Martha's, handmaids, or wives. So that's an interesting thing about it, is that there's a certain amount of power in the fact that the aunts can read and write and are allowed to read books and so on. And we'll see that this is definitely one way that Aunt Lydia gains power. For the men, there are certain roles available for the men in Gilead. So there are commanders, which are the highest level, the kind of high class, powerful, wealthy men in the society. We don't really know what they do. They're businessmen that seem to run the government and the businesses. And they're often, as you will find from reading the book, kind of away in their studies doing who knows what. And there are also guardians who were like the chauffeurs and the ones who kind of guard the households of the commanders. So that's another role that some men play. There are what's called angels, who are kind of the police men. They are men. They're the policemen of Gilead who enforce the oppressive regime. And then there are workers like gardeners and kind of working class men in the novel as well. So those are the roles open to the men. Okay, I hope that gives you enough context so that you can go in and read the book and kind of understand the setting and the context out of which it comes. In this short video, I've talked about the setting of the Testaments, including the place and the time. I've talked about the narration, the 3 different narrators of the text, and I've talked about the various roles that men and women play in Gilead. Thank you very much for listening.